Okay, so you sent us this really interesting part of the Forged Act, and what we're going to zero in on today is Section 103, I think it is, and this is all about how future defense reporting requirements are going to automatically expire or sunset.
Right.
So think of this as your guide to figuring out what to do about this change, what kind of prep work you might want to start thinking about now.
Yeah.
And just so you know, this is going to be the first in a whole series of deep dives that we're doing into the Forged Act. We're going to try to cover everything in there.
Right.
But yeah. Let's just jump right in.
Okay, so Section 103 of the Forged Act it came out December 2024, and it basically is a whole different way of thinking about defense reporting.
Yeah.
The main idea is that any new reporting requirement that's put into law after December 2024 that doesn't have its own expiration date built in will automatically expire after 5 years, unless there's a specific decision made to renew it.
Mm.
And when I say a new reporting requirement, I mean it only applies to future requirements that come out after December 2024. It doesn't apply to all the stuff you're already dealing with right now.
Yeah.
And I think to really understand why this is happening, you need to kind of look at the bigger picture. You know, there's this constant effort to try and make defense acquisition more efficient and more streamlined.
Yeah. And, you know, you've seen this push, haven't you? I mean, the GAO, they keep putting out these reports. Like, what was it? GAO 25107-003, I think was the number.
Yeah.
But they really highlight how all these reporting requirements piling up just make things so slow and inefficient.
It's a huge problem.
Yeah. So this feels like they're trying to tackle that issue head on with legislation.
Yeah.
And it also ties in directly to the 2022 National Defense Strategy.
Right.
You know, with all that emphasis on speed and getting new capabilities out there faster.
Speed and agility.
And this isn't a totally brand new idea, is it? I mean, we've seen hints of this before, right? Like in 2018, they passed the NDAA, and that actually got rid of a bunch of reporting requirements that were already in place.
That's right.
And then there was that report by Senator Wicker, Restoring Freedom's Forge or something like that.
Yeah, Restoring Freedom's Forge.
And he made a pretty strong case for getting rid of all this bureaucratic red tape.
Absolutely. So if you look at it from a bigger picture point of view, this section of the Act is really all about trying to reduce the amount of bureaucracy that the DoD has to deal with.
Right.
And when you think about it like that, all the positive effects that they're hoping for start to make a lot of sense.
Okay.
So less paperwork, less administrative burden for the DoD means they free up time and resources that they can then spend on things that are actually mission critical. Or maybe they can use that freed up time to come up with new innovations in the acquisition process.
Yeah.
Because they don't have so much overhead to worry about anymore. And really, at the end of the day, it's about making sure that the reporting that we're doing is actually useful and valuable and not just something we keep doing forever, because we've always done it that way.
Yeah. Okay. So those potential benefits sound pretty good. But like any big change, there are probably going to be some challenges or some unintended consequences that we need to be aware of, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you think our listeners should be thinking about?
Well, it's all about balance, isn't it? One thing that I think is a potential concern is that we might lose valuable information that we've built up over time. You know what I mean? Like if a report expires automatically and we don't archive the information properly, or we don't realize how important it is before it's too late, we could lose access to historical data that's really crucial for making good decisions in the future.
Right.
And there's also the question of congressional oversight. You know, Congress uses these reports to keep tabs on what the DoD is doing and to make sure they're doing things right. So if they feel like their ability to do that is being weakened in any way, that could be a problem.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of consistency. With this new system, you're going to have all these different reports expiring at different times based on when they were first put into place. So it's going to make it harder to get a clear and complete picture of what's going on, because the information is going to be coming in at all these different intervals. You know, imagine you're trying to understand a certain technology area or something.
Right.
Before, all the reports might have been on the same cycle, so you could get a really good overview. Now, some of them might expire this year, some of them next year, some of them 5 years from now.
Yeah.
So you might be missing crucial information at any given time. And then, ironically enough, the whole process of having to review and decide whether to renew all these reports could actually create more administrative work.
Oh, wow.
Which would kind of defeat the whole purpose of trying to make things more efficient in the first place.
Right.
And then the last thing, and this is a big one, is that we might just accidentally miss a report that's about to expire. You know, there are going to be so many reports to keep track of that it's easy to imagine one slipping through the cracks.
Okay. So yeah, those are some serious potential problems that people need to be aware of. But the source material that you've highlighted also talks about mitigations. Right.
which I guess is how they plan to deal with these challenges.
Oh.
So what are some of the specific steps that they're suggesting people take to get ahead of this?
Well, the idea of mitigations is really key here. It's about turning this challenge into something that we can actually manage and maybe even use to our advantage.
Hmm.
So the sources really emphasize the importance of setting up clear and proactive processes for reviewing reports well before their expiration date.
Okay.
So that means having systems in place to identify exactly when a report is getting close to expiring, and then automatically triggering a really thorough review to figure out if it's still needed and if it's still providing value.
Right.
And it's also super important to keep comprehensive and easy to access archives of all the important historical data. Just because a report expires doesn't mean that the information it contains suddenly becomes useless. We need to make sure that we're preserving that information for future use.
And communication is key here. We need to be talking to Congress regularly about which reports are coming up for expiration so that they're always in the loop and so that we can address any concerns that they might have before they turn into big problems.
That makes sense.
And then there's the practical side of things, making sure that we have enough money and enough people dedicated to managing these review and renewal processes effectively.
Right.
We can't just expect people to do all this extra work without giving them the resources they need to do it properly. And then engaging with stakeholders early on and often is really important.
Okay.
And that means not just people within the DoD, but also people on Capitol Hill and even industry partners in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
We need to all be working together to figure out which reports are truly essential and which ones we can let go of. And for those of you who want to get a better understanding of the big picture of how the acquisition process works, I'd recommend taking a look at DoD Directive 5000.01. It lays out the groundwork for a lot of these reporting requirements, and it can give you a good framework for thinking about how these review processes should be set up.
Okay. So that's all really good advice. So who are the people who are going to be most affected by all of this? And are there any groups that might be hesitant about these changes or even actively resist them?
So the people in the DoD who are going to be most directly affected are probably the reporting staff.
The ones who actually put the reports together.
Yeah, exactly. They're the ones who are actually creating and submitting these reports. And then the program managers who use the information in those reports are going to be affected too, because they're going to have to make the case for why their report should be renewed.
Right.
And then, of course, the congressional staff who use these reports to do their oversight work are going to be impacted as well. And they're going to have to come up with new ways of keeping track of which reports are expiring when. And then the whole acquisition workforce is going to feel the effects of this in some way or another, even if it's just indirectly. Now, in terms of who might resist these changes, you could definitely see some pushback from the congressional oversight committees. They're going to want to make sure that they don't lose any of their ability to hold the DoD accountable. And then defense contractors might be a little wary of this too, because they use those reports to understand what's going on in the defense world and to see what kind of contracts might be coming up.
Yeah.
So if they lose access to some of that information, they're not going to be happy. And then the GAO and other auditing organizations might be concerned that they're not going to have the data they need to do their jobs properly. And policy analysts who need that long-term data to do their strategic planning are going to be worried too.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I think most of their concerns are coming from a good place. You know, they want to make sure that there's still oversight and accountability and that decisions are being made based on solid data.
Right. Okay. So say you're someone who's working within the defense system and you want to make sure that your organization is implementing these changes effectively. What kind of resources are you going to need?
Yeah.
And how do you even measure whether you're doing a good job or not?
Okay. So when it comes to resources, there are a few key areas where you're probably going to need to make some investments.
Yeah.
The first one is training. You're going to need to make sure that all your staff are fully trained on how these new automatic sunset processes work and what the procedures are for reviewing and renewing reports.
Yeah.
And then you're going to need to develop some clear policies and guidelines on how these reviews are going to be conducted, what criteria will be used to decide whether to renew a report, and who's going to be responsible for each step of the process. And it's quite possible that you might need to upgrade your IT systems.
So you can keep track of all this stuff?
Yeah, exactly. You need a way to track the life cycle of each report, including when it's set to expire. And you need a system for archiving all that historical data so it doesn't get lost. And you're going to want to have some legal support available too, just in case you run into any tricky regulatory or compliance issues.
That makes sense. Now, how do you know if you're doing this right? How do you measure success?
Well, there are a few key metrics that you can look at. One is a reduction in the overall administrative costs associated with all this reporting.
So basically, are you saving money?
Exactly. And are you saving time? You can track how much time people are saving by getting rid of unnecessary reports. And of course, you want to track the renewal rate of the reports that are actually important. And you want to make sure that the essential information is being identified and that those reports are being renewed properly. And getting feedback from stakeholders is really important too.
Yeah.
You can do surveys or interviews with people in the DoD and on Capitol Hill to get their insights on how things are working. And then in the long run, if one of your goals is to boost innovation, you can look for signs that there are more innovative products and technologies being developed and adopted. And it's worth mentioning that the GAO has already developed a set of methods for assessing how well defense acquisition reforms are working. So you can use that as a framework for thinking about how to measure your success.
Okay, great. So it's interesting that the source material also talks a little bit about some of the other options that they considered before they decided to go with this automatic sunset rule.
Yeah.
What were some of the other ideas that were on the table?
Well, the automatic sunset is just one way to try and streamline defense reporting. They could have gone with something like mandatory periodic reviews of all reporting requirements. So like every 3 years or every 5 years, they would have to review every single report to see if it was still needed, but they wouldn't automatically expire.
Okay.
That way you wouldn't have the risk of losing important reports accidentally. Or they could have taken a more targeted approach where they specifically identify and repeal reports that everyone agrees are outdated or redundant or just not useful anymore.
Right.
Instead of just automatically getting rid of everything after 5 years. And then there's the idea of automating more of the reporting process. If you can make it easier and faster to collect and analyze and share the data, maybe you don't have to get rid of the report entirely. And then they could have just focused on improving communication and collaboration between all the stakeholders.
Okay.
So the people who create the reports, the people who use the information, and the people who oversee the process, if they're all talking to each other regularly, maybe they can figure out how to streamline things without having to resort to drastic measures.
Yeah, like a more organic approach.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of the experts who write about defense acquisition reform tend to favor these kinds of more nuanced and multifaceted approaches.
Okay. So to sum up, what's the key takeaway here for our listener about Section 103 of the Forged Act?
Well, the main message, I think, is that Section 103 is a big step towards trying to streamline how defense reporting works in the future. And the way they're doing it is by automatically getting rid of all new reporting requirements after 5 years. Now, this could have some really big benefits for the DoD.
Yeah.
It could reduce bureaucracy, free up resources, and make the whole system more efficient.
Right.
But to make those benefits a reality, you can't just sit back and let reports expire. You have to be proactive. You have to set up really good review processes well in advance of those expiration dates. And you have to make sure that you're protecting all the important historical information that's been collected over the years. And you have to make sure that there's still enough oversight to make sure everything's being done properly.
Yeah.
It's not a simple fix.
Yeah.
It takes planning and effort, and you have to be aware of the risks like losing valuable information or reducing congressional oversight. And you have to have a plan to deal with those risks if they come up.
Okay, so it's not just about getting rid of reports, it's about creating a whole new system for managing them. Okay, so here's a final thought for our listener. Think about your specific role and your team and where you fit into the whole defense ecosystem. How can you start preparing now for this new system of automatic sunsets? How can you make sure that your organization is ready to take advantage of the potential benefits without putting any critical information or oversight at risk? It's a tough challenge, but it's an important one. And your ability to think ahead and plan strategically is going to be crucial for making this work. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.